Hello, and welcome again to the Last Day Book Club, where we are reading The Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox by Bradley Booth, the story of a Russian SDA pastor imprisoned in a Siberian prison camp for his faith, where he refuses to work on the Sabbath, enduring instead whatever punishment is meted out to him for that choice. In our last reading, God continued his miracle of getting old Maxim to put out that extra burst of energy every Friday that they might meet the quota of water necessary to keep the Sabbath and not have to work. The manifestation of this continuing miracle made a powerful witness to the whole prison camp, the warden included, and his friend Petya the cook was so overcome with the manifestation of God's power on behalf of Nikolai's faithfulness that he asked to be baptized. Chapter 34 of the Miracle of the Seventh-day Ox. It took some work, but Nikolai was able to do as they had planned. Digging a water hole at the spring was quite easy. Planning when they would go through with the baptism was a bit trickier. One Friday night, after the men in camp had all gone to sleep, Nikolai and Petya sneaked out behind the barracks and circled around to the opposite side of the camp. Once on the road, they began the long walk to the spring. It was a risk. No doubt prairie wolves were watching their every move. But the baptism went off without a hitch. Fortunately for them, the evening was warmer than most that time of the year. Both men stood in the waterhole at the spring, savoring the joy of this sacred experience. Afterwards, they walked the distance to camp, singing a hymn Nikolai had taught Petya and shivering in the dampness of the cool evening. And then summer was gone, and fall seemed to pass them by completely. Before they knew it, snow flurries began to fall, the reindeer started to migrate, and the snow geese flew southward through the skies. By October, winter had settled in. Nikolai was glad for the long underwear the warden had supplied him with. In spite of their past, he began to feel a warm spot in his heart now for the warden. To Nikolai, it seemed the warden was trying to say in some simple way that he was sorry for all the trouble he had given him. The days were short, but that didn't change the number of barrels needed each week. In order to bring in the required quota, Nikolai and Maxim found themselves working in the dark several hours before dawn each morning, and then 3 or 4 hours again after sunset. The ice was forming thick at the spring now, and Nikolai had to use an axe to cut through it. Of course, this took time and made the trips longer, but Nikolai had other things to worry about. In the cold, dark hours of the winter, Nikolai knew he needed to be watchful of the wolves. Food was scarce now on the tundra, so a man and an ox might prove tempting to their hungry stomachs. But God was merciful, and although Nikolai and Maxim had a few scares, they managed to stay alive and well. The cold, hard winter passed somehow, and then spring gave way to summer. By now, Nikolai had accepted the fact that he might be in this prison camp for a very long time. When he was tempted to wonder why God needed him in this remote tundra outpost, he remembered Petya's decision for Jesus, and he contemplated the salvation of the other 300 men who were imprisoned at the camp. More than anything, he wanted them to know God as he did. Eventually, he started Bible studies with those who were interested. And before long, there was a small band that met regularly. For 7 more years, Nikolai spent his days at the remote prison camp on the steppes of Siberia. For 7 years, he worked with Maxim to haul water from the spring. For all those years, he remained a constant witness to the power of God in the life of a dedicated Christian. To the men in the camp, the life and work of Nikolai and Maxim became a living testimony. Visitors who came to the camp witnessed the phenomena for themselves. Those who left the prison told of a man and an ox that ran all day every Friday so that they could rest all day Saturday. And then one day, the army officer who had freed Nikolai from the crate came back to the prison camp. When he saw Nikolai and Maxim hauling water, he remembered the incident from 8 years before. But now, the colonel was told quite a different story. When he heard about Maxim's strange habit of running all day Friday to bring in a 2-day supply of water in one, he was amazed. With great interest, he asked Nikolai about the operation, and Nikolai shared the whole incredible tale. He told how desperate he had been those first few weeks, trying to get Maxim to haul enough water fast enough to earn a Sabbath day's rest. And of course, he told how good God had been to him. He explained how the ordeal had tested his faith in God and how he had almost given up. The miracle of Maxim's marathon run that first Friday stirred the colonel's heart, and the repeat performance the following Friday was even more surprising to him. The colonel could see that Nikolai was a good man. He could see clearly now that the preacher had not been guilty of insubordination. In fact, the testimony of his daily life was proof that he had been willing all along to do whatever was asked of him. Most important, the colonel saw that Nikolai had been faithful to his God. Without a doubt, he had been willing to do whatever his God asked of him. The colonel then shocked Nikolai by taking him to the warden's office to announce that he was going to sign his release forms. He was free to go home on the train to be with his family once again. You have shown us all what a man of character can do if he is motivated, the colonel said proudly. And you have shown what devotion can do for a man who loves his God. The colonel chuckled and then added, I guess none of us have ever seen an animal as crazy as your ox. If you and your God can get a stubborn ox to run like that, you could probably do just about anything. With tears in his eyes, Nikolai thanked the colonel for his kindness, and then he took his few personal belongings, followed the colonel and his horse back to the train, and began the long journey back to Kiev. Nikolai returned to the life of a pastor and continued to witness for God during the good times as he had during the bad. His church members rejoiced with him that God had brought him home from his long ordeal, and they thanked Jesus for his faithfulness on the fire. Today, like every other Seventh-day Adventist Christian in the former Soviet Union, Nikolai Panchuk waits for Jesus to come again. One day soon, he will see Jesus coming in the clouds of heaven and hear the words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful to me in small things and in big. You have suffered for my sake. Come and enter into the joy of your Lord." See Matthew 25 and verse 21. The end of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of the miracle of the seventh-day ox. But that's not the end of the story. After Nikolai left for home, a new prisoner came to camp who knew nothing of the man and the ox who ran all day on Fridays so that they could rest on Saturdays. The new man, Gennady, was also given the job of hauling water from the spring every day, and he quickly learned to plod along behind the ox cart. Like Nikolai, he knew that the job was the one most hated by all the men in the camp. No one else wanted to do all that walking. However, he also discovered that Maxim was stubborn and would refuse to do anything that was not part of his regular regiment. The old ox refused to be hurried. He refused to be intimidated. He refused to continue working after dark. Not surprisingly, Gennady soon came to admit that he wasn't the one in charge while on their trips to the spring. Maxim obviously was. They were up at the crack of dawn every day, plodding laboriously back and forth to the spring, but always on Maxim's own terms. But on that first Friday morning, Gennady was in for the surprise of his life. The old ox fairly ran his legs off all day, and Gennady was so shocked he didn't know what to think. No one had bothered beforehand to tell him about Maxim's strange habits or his famous track record. Maybe it was because they wanted to see the look on Gennady's face when he finally witnessed it for himself. Maybe they were looking forward to hearing the new driver rant on and on about how crazy the old ox was. Maybe it was just that the whole thing had been going on for so long now that they never thought about it as a strange and unusual event anymore. But on that first Friday morning, as Maxim came running back into the camp, Gennady came huffing and puffing along behind him. The poor prisoner looked as though he had been running a race. When he finally came to a stop, he bent over with his hands on his knees, wheezing and desperately trying to catch his breath. Perspiration dripped from his face, and his clothes were completely soaked with sweat. But if he thought he was going to get a rest, he was in for a second surprise. Maxim never really gave Gennady time to get his breathing back to normal. No sooner were the water barrels unloaded from the cart than the old ox took off again in a cloud of dust. And that was the last anyone saw of them until more than an hour later, when they came racing back down the road into camp again. This time, Gennady was even further behind. Who would have thought that an ox pulling a cart full of water barrels would outdo a man running on foot? Of course, Maxim was used to this. He'd been doing it for more than 8 years now. The two of them went at it all morning. On the ride out to the spring, Gennady jumped on the cart for a rest. However, when the cart had 2 full barrels on it, he had to run on foot all the way back. Each time they came racing back into camp, Gennady would take a few minutes to rest. But he knew he dared not wait too long, for fear the ox would take off for the spring again with the full water barrel still on the cart. By late afternoon, Gennady looked as though he had been running a marathon, and it appeared he would drop from exhaustion at any moment. He might never have made it through the afternoon had Petya not come to his aid the last few trips to help him unload the full water barrels from the cart. "What's wrong with that animal?" Gennady would shout every time he came stumbling into the camp. "He's going to kill me." Of course, everyone just laughed because they knew the rest of the story and were having their fun at Gennady's expense. But by the end of the day, Gennady could take it no longer. As the sun neared its resting place below the horizon, and old Maxim had pulled the bumping cart into the camp for the last time, Gennady slumped to the ground, his back against the wheel of the ox cart. "I give up," he panted and closed his eyes as Petya and several other men gathered around. "The ox is possessed," he rasped, putting his hands to his head. "There is no other explanation." "Yes, there is," a voice sounded nearby, and Gennady turned to see the warden standing behind them. The warden paused for effect. "You see, that preacher from Kiev has been training old Maxim for years. Nikolai Panchak refused to work on the 7th day of every week, and he spoiled the ox with that business of his. Ruined him. He'll never be the same again." The warden looked around the circle of men and then directly at Gennady. "There is no doubt about it in my mind. That preacher made a Sabbath keeper of the ox." And truly he had. Old Maxim had turned into a 7th-day ox. But it hadn't really been any of Nikolai's doing. The preacher had run side by side with Maxim all those years to bring enough water to last through the Sabbath, and it had always taken a marathon Friday to finish the job each week. The credit for such a phenomena was all God's, of course, and everyone who wanted to know the truth had been told so by Nikolai. Even after Nikolai had left the prison camp and returned home to his family, the influence of his holy life lived on through the testimony of an ox. Old Maxim continued to be true to his duties, ready to be used by his Creator as a witness for the Sabbath. Nikolai Panchak was gone, but when there was no one left to share the gospel story, there was still Maxim, the 7th-day ox. the end of chapter 35 and the end of the story of Nikolai Panchak and old Maxim in the miracle of the seventh-day ox. It is our prayer at SWM Radio that all who have listened to the Last Day Book Club and the miracle of the seventh-day ox, that your faith will be renewed and strengthened, and that just like Nikolai Panchak and like Pavel Goya in one miracle after another, that as the times around us become more perilous, when we will be forced to take a stand for the Sabbath versus the laws of the land, which will require us to stand for Sunday, that we will be strengthened by these stories to indeed take that stand for our God. May His richest blessings be upon each and every one who listens to these stories.